Western Mexico may not be a place that jumps to mind when we think of Mesoamerica. It certainly doesn't have the same cultural and popular clout that cultures of central Mexico, Oaxaca, and the Maya region have. Until the middle of the 20th century, West Mexico was a neglected area of archaeological investigation, and it was often written off as a crude backwater. These attitudes would start to be challenged as ancient pottery from West Mexico made its way into the markets of Mexico and the United States and began to capture the imagination of artists and art collectors. It quickly became clear that ancient West Mexico produced an incredible and dazzling corpus of art and art styles. The resulting intrigue, coupled with further archaeological research in the second half of the 20th century, began to shed light on a hitherto unknown culture, the Teuchitlán tradition, a thriving culture that was every bit as vibrant as the other cultures of the classic period in Mesoamerica. Today, let's punch our tickets to West Mexico and find out what awaits us. Quick word before we get started. There will be a channel announcement at the end of the video, so please stay tuned afterwards. Today, we are focusing on the western states of Mexico along its Pacific coast. Archaeologists typically define West Mexico as the Mexican states of Sinaloa, Nayarit, Jalisco, Colima, and Michoacan. In this episode, we'll be centered in Jalisco, Nayarit, and Colima, but at times we may stroll into the neighboring states. The region is one of geographic diversity. The warm coastal waters of the Pacific are rich and teeming with resources, while the coastal lowlands lead up to the Sierra Madre Occidental and into the highlands. Cutting through West Mexico and continuing to the Atlantic coast is the Trans Mexican Volcanic Belt, a range of extinct and active volcanoes which have blessed the area with rich soils and vast deposits of obsidian. Compared to eastern watersheds in Mexico, rivers in West Mexico are smaller, receive less rainfall, and have much smaller surface discharge. However, several lakes and wetlands dot the area, the largest being Lake Chapala, which is fed by the Lerma River. These have always been and continue to be important areas for human settlement. This is a diverse area with several biomes in relatively close proximity. One consistent element about the climate, though, is the seasons. These are characterized by a rainy season from June to October and a dry season the rest of the year. Taken together, this was a pretty good place to live, and I'm sure those who have fallen in love with cities like Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta will definitely agree. Okay, let's talk about sources for a moment. Compared to other areas of Mesoamerica, West Mexico's past is poorly understood. The Teuchitlán culture and other associated cultures are known primarily from archaeology. Sadly, there are no ancient codices that can illuminate our understanding. However, we do have a very impressive corpus of art which can shed a surprising amount of light on this culture. Later colonial records from the area can also help us understand pre Hispanic practices, but these are relatively few. Colonial accounts or ethnographies from better understood Mesoamerican cultures, like the Nahuas or the Purepecha, are also used by archaeologists and anthropologists to analyze West Mexican traditions. It's not perfect by any means, but it's what we're going to be working with. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's take a seat and dig in. Human habitation in West Mexico likely dates back around 15,000 BCE, but the earliest undisputed dates come from Los Hacheros Cave at approximately 10,000 BCE. Archaic populations lived as generalists, relying on hunting, fishing, and harvesting of wild plants. The limited amount of archaic sites means that we can't go into great detail during this period, but from what we know about the rest of Mesoamerica, we can observe an ongoing and important development. People were encouraging the growth of useful plants, and many of these would eventually be completely domesticated, and in turn permitted people to become increasingly sedentary. The Archaic period in Mesoamerica officially wraps up around 2000 BCE, but the transition from the Archaic to the Preclassic period in West Mexico was slow. After 1500 BCE, people began to settle in permanent villages, farming maize and other crops. One of the earliest documented traditions from this area is the Capacha tradition in modern day Colima, which began around 1000 BCE. This coastal culture actually stretched far outside the purview of our topic today, ranging from Sinaloa to Guerrero, and gives us the earliest ceramics in West Mexico. These ceramics show some similarities to foreign pottery styles, especially to Tlatilco pottery from the Valley of Mexico, although what exactly this says about contact with central Mexico is still poorly understood. Some archaeologists have also pointed out similarities between Capacha ceramics, particularly stirrup vessels, which have a lot of resemblance to Andean pottery, although it's worth pointing out that central Mexico was also producing stirrup vessels at this time. That said, South American connections are still pretty speculative and are best discussed elsewhere. Some of you viewers in the audience may have noticed something odd about those possible influences. The Olmec were absent. Now, we've covered the Olmec legacy in a previous video, so if you want more information about that, give it a watch. For those who haven't seen that and don't want to pause and watch it, what you need to know is that Olmec art, writing, beliefs, and ideologies had a huge influence across Mesoamerica, including central Mexico. Sites like Chalcatzingo and Teopantecuantitlan show unmistakable evidence of Olmec presence, although the nature of that presence remains debated. However, that influence does not appear to have spread to West Mexico, or at least if it did, archaeologists have not yet found any good evidence for it. This is important because it may explain some differences that we see between West Mexico and the rest of Mesoamerica. Historically, this visible lack of Olmec influence has been one reason why the area was written off as a historically backwards region. As the pre-classic period progressed, a very important tradition began to develop in West Mexico between 800 and 300 BCE, the shaft tomb tradition. This tradition covered an area from Colima through Jalisco and into Nayarit. As the name implies, this culture is characterized by its use of shaft tombs in their mortuary practices. You're probably wondering what a shaft tomb even is. These were tombs that were dug straight down into the earth, terminating in a tomb chamber. The earliest shaft tomb in West Mexico actually comes from northwestern Michoacan, and that is the site of El Opeño. This site dates from approximately 1500 BCE, which actually makes it the oldest discovered tomb in Mesoamerica. However, archaeologists debate its connection to the shaft tomb tradition to the west. Looking at this diagram from one of the El Opeño tombs, you can see that these tombs are a bit different from what we see in the later shaft tomb tradition. Some see it as a forerunner, while others argue that it's only a stylistically similar tomb used by a different culture. The earliest shaft tombs in West Mexico appear in the Middle Pre-Classic, but by 300 BCE, the tradition had really taken hold across West Mexico. At that point, some of these tombs were reaching monumental proportions. These shaft tombs show a lot of variation. They were sometimes dug into the soil, while others were cut into soft volcanic rock, or tuff. Sizes varied drastically between different tombs. Some shafts were as short as 1 meter. The longest shafts can reach 19 meters. At the bottom of each shaft is a large chamber where the dead were interred. Sometimes these shaft tombs can even have multiple chambers that could contain an individual burial or multiple burials. Now, it's worth noting that shaft tombs were not the mortuary mode for everyone. Some people got buried in simple graves, others were interred in large pots, and some got shaft tombs. Many shaft tombs appear to have been reserved for specific individuals, such as prominent families or individuals. The most elaborate shaft tombs typically contained remains of multiple people and were sometimes used over an extended period of time. In such cases, this meant that tombs had to be opened periodically to allow the dead to be cared for and for the newly deceased to be interred. Such openings appear to have been done at very specific times of the year, because analysis of human remains in these tombs show that they were deposited in various states of decomposition and articulation. The reason for this could be that they wanted to time tomb openings until after the harvest and the rainy season. Not only would this have been a good time for the community to excavate the shaft and tomb, but they also would not have had to worry about the rain and moisture collapsing the shaft. There also could have been other cultural reasons that remain unknown to us. The tomb shaft would have been sealed with a large rock slab, but these could occasionally fail and flood the tomb with earth and mud. The dead interred in these chambers would have been furnished with various grave goods, particularly food offerings, jewelry, ceramic wares, and sculptures. Depending on the status of the person or people buried, these could be simple use wares or lavishly made works of art. Most of the West Mexican art that you'll see in museums, as well as this episode, are actually from these tombs, but the dark side of that is that most of these works were looted. As soon as people realized that there was money to be made in selling these pieces, they lost no time in figuring out how to locate shaft tombs, loot them, and sell the goods on the antiquities market. Oh, and to make matters worse, many museum pieces have been found to be forgeries. And this is still a problem even today, unfortunately. That sadly means that most shaft tomb excavations are salvage operations completed long after looters ransacked the place. This loss of archaeological context means that the origins of the shaft tomb tradition are poorly understood. So if those earlier dates sounded a bit vague, that's why. The picture is not entirely bleak, though, because archaeologists have managed to get very lucky in the last few decades with the discovery of unlooted tombs, so our understanding has improved a bit. While we're discussing tomb offerings, let's shift gears and discuss the most well known grave goods, the sculptures of West Mexico in the shaft tomb tradition. I should clarify that because so much of these are looted, archaeologists can't be certain if all of these works were designed for graves or if they had other uses in life. For all we know, these could have been portable personal items, religious objects, or individual pieces in larger sets. If we knew the context for these pieces, we could answer such questions with much more confidence. Nonetheless, these figures and scenes are an incredibly rich array of art that many archaeologists and art historians have devoted their entire careers to studying. West Mexican pottery, like moche pottery in Peru, has a huge breadth of subject, which means that there's a lot that we can learn from these works. However, it also consists of many different styles that were made in different areas, so we're going to do a quick run through of these styles. This is not a comprehensive list, and there are some disagreements, but I consider these the most important and agreed upon styles. Have it out in the comments if you disagree. In the area around Ixtlan del Rio in Nayarit, hollow figurines like these are common. These usually depict stylized men and women in energetic poses with exaggerated and caricatured expressions. Some appear to even have clothing and accoutrements of ranked office. Also famous from these areas are what I call the dioramas, and these sculptures are actually among my favorites because they depict important scenes of life, such as ceremonies and family events, in remarkable detail. To the west, in South Nayarit around Pedro Lagunitas, comes another style of sculpture referred to as chinescos. These are characterized by the subjects depicted in calm and reserved poses with squinted eyes. In northwest Jalisco, we have the Arenal and San Sebastian styles that feature naturalist male and female subjects done in very stately poses. Ameca Etzalan sculptures, also from Jalisco, show figures with rounded limbs and dynamic poses. One of the most complex styles is the Colima tradition from, you'll never guess, Colima. Colima style ceramics tend to be burnished and display a huge range of subject matter from chieftains to warriors to shamans, musicians, and acrobats. However, the most famous Colima sculptures are probably their animals, such as birds, turtles, and especially chubby dogs and puppies. I mean, look at these guys, they're adorable. But don't get too attached to the puppies because I'm going to ruin them later. Personal note here, one thing that I like a lot about these sculptures is that they capture a lot of everyday moments and people. We see couples embracing, mothers with their children, people playing games, and families together in their homes. There's something beautifully cozy and heartfelt in a lot of these that warms my cold, jaded heart. That's not to say that everything is rainbows and cosmic love. We'll see some violence in the clay later. Okay, so why am I bringing up all these styles? We need to understand that the shaft tomb tradition was a tradition and not a unified culture. Although there were many traits and values shared by these peoples, there was also variation among their customs, and this is reflected in their art styles. We are not going to go into detail on all of these local cultures. My apologies, but time is limited. For the rest of this episode, we're going to focus on one of these cultures that participated in and emerged from the shaft tomb tradition, and would in turn influence West Mexico, the Teuchitlán culture. The Teuchitlán culture was centered in Jalisco, specifically in a core area around the Tequila volcano and the surrounding valleys. Now, before you get excited, Tequila Volcano is sadly not a mountain that gushes Don Julio and Jose Cuervo, but instead an extinct volcano from which the eponymous drink ultimately derives its name, because this is the area where tequila was first distilled. Okay, so I guess in a roundabout way, it does actually refer to tequila. Although this area isn't very big, it is a very resource rich area with fertile soils, wetlands, salt deposits, and deposits of obsidian, greenstone, and copper. That said, the origins of the Teuchitlán culture are poorly understood because archaeology has recovered very little from the early and middle pre-classic periods. However, archaeologists can conclude that sometime around 300 BCE, complex societies began to emerge and exhibit monumental architecture and elite burials. The best early example of this period is the site of Huitzilapa in Jalisco. This was one of a series of small settlements in the Huitzilapa Valley, and the site itself was likely the main civil and ceremonial center of the valley, akin to a modern day county or municipal seat. This can be seen in the site architecture, which is far more grand than the other minor settlements in its orbit. Archaeology has shown that around 1 CE, the inhabitants constructed an impressive ceremonial center with raised circular complexes, plazas, cruciform residential units, and ball courts. While some of these designs are familiar to the Mesoamerican repertoire, like raised platforms and ball courts, other elements look very strange. We'll discuss the architecture in more detail once we see more mature examples later, but looking at this town plan, we can conclude that some sort of centralized leadership was able to plan and execute this radical design. What did this leadership look like? Thankfully for us, we can get a very good look at these elites because Huitzilapa also contains shaft tombs that have yielded a wealth of information. Not only is this one of the few unlooted tombs to have been excavated, it's actually the first to have ever been discovered, all the way back in 1993. The fact that it took so long to find an intact tomb before looters did really underscores the scale of looting in West Mexico. The tomb itself was dug beneath a platform with a shaft of 7.6 meters and two chambers on a north south axis. Both chambers held three individuals with lavish offerings and even remains of food. Analysis of the bodies shows that 5 of the 6 were related, so it's likely that this tomb was for an elite family. It also shows that special lineages were accruing more and more power in society. These burials also allow us to see a hierarchy between the entombed individuals. One of these, an approximately 45-year-old male, is the most richly adorned, with bracelets, nose rings, earrings, pendants, and a cloth made of thousands of shell beads. You may assume that those shells came from the nearby Pacific coast, but analysis has proven that some came all the way from the Caribbean. Jade found in the tomb has also been sourced to Guerrero. The individuals in this tomb were clearly people of influence who had no trouble acquiring luxury resources from distant places and having experienced local craftsmen turn them into treasures. The women in the tomb are also lavishly buried, but have more domestic goods such as spindle whorls and grinding stones. Monumental tombs of this scale are very rare at Huitzilapa and similar sites. These were restricted to the privileged few, while most people were buried in smaller shaft tombs or simple burial pits. This is a clear reminder of the class differences that were emerging in Teuchitlan society. This is all impressive enough, but things kicked into high gear just before the pre-classic period ended and the classic period began. Those social distinctions and the construction of monumental architecture intensified, and we see a trend where monumental civic architecture began to replace shaft tombs as the symbols of elite status. The reason for these changes are not entirely clear, but scholars have suggested local competition for resources and prestige to the growth of neighboring cultures and traditions to the east, like Teotihuacan. Whatever the reasons, there's a sudden demographic shift that archaeologists Phil Weigand and Chris Beekman refer to as nuclearization. Please note that in this case, nuclearization does not mean that they developed atom-splitting armaments, but rather the development of a nucleus within a regional system. Beginning at 200 CE, the population began to aggregate into larger settlements in the core area. These Teuchitlan settlements, complete with circular architecture, range in size and complexity, but they have two things in common. First, they were located in strategic locations where they could control or monitor access through valley passes. This suggests that an effort was being made to control the borders of the core area. Whether these were safeguards against hostile neighbors, outposts to facilitate trade and communication, or both is uncertain. It also suggests a coordinated policy across the area. Second, these settlements have easy access to good agricultural lands. Speaking of agriculture, we see a new agricultural feature during this time, raised fields, although you may also hear them referred to as chinampas. Regular viewers are no stranger to this, but we're going to explain it anyway for the new kids. Raised fields involved creating a raised bed in a permanently or seasonally flooded environment. These raised fields allowed crops to be safely irrigated without the threat of them being washed away or the roots getting waterlogged. Exhausted soil from the beds could be replaced by fresh soil from the wetlands. This is a pretty widespread agricultural technique across Meso and South America, and it's no surprise why. It was brilliant. Though such agricultural projects required a lot of labor and organization to construct and maintain, it was worth it because this infrastructure was extremely productive and sustainable. In fact, during the Classic period, the population of the Teuchitlán core area grew to approximately 40,000 people, and these fields played a very important role in sustaining this new population. These new developments point to some type of unified authority. It's debated whether there was a capital of the core area or whether authority was spread across different centers. However, there is one site that stands out in the center of the Teuchitlán core, the site of Guachimontones. This is the largest Teuchitlán site, and if you're familiar with Mesoamerica, you've probably seen pictures of its beautiful green mounds and pyramids. Guachimontones is a fascinating site, but it was poorly understood for most of the 20th century until Phil Wigand and Joseph Mountjoy mapped the site in the 1970s and brought the site to international attention. The city is famous for its striking ceremonial center with its circular architecture and arrangement. The ceremonial center is perched on a bluff with a view across the basin and is composed of several circular precincts made up of platform mounds enclosing a plaza with a large circular pyramid in the center. Archaeology of the surrounding mounds suggests that these buildings were not residences. They likely would have had thatched buildings on top of them that would have acted as temples or religious structures. Also present at the site is a large ball court between the two largest precincts. A second ceremonial center, Loma Alta, is located to the northeast on a hill. Beyond these ceremonial precincts were residential neighborhoods and farms. The site itself had a population around 6,000 people, which admittedly is not as large as contemporary urban sites across Mesoamerica, but by West Mexican standards, this was a huge leap. Let's give this architecture some attention by starting with the pyramids. These pyramids were likely an outgrowth of earlier shaft tomb customs in the Highland Lakes that utilized burial platforms with their shaft tombs. Those earlier mounds could have been enlarged into the circular pyramids that we see here and then flanked by orbiting platforms. It may be tempting to look at these as something wholly unique in Mesoamerica, especially when we think of pyramid designs across Mesoamerica, but there are actually other examples of circular pyramids in Mesoamerica, most notably at Quiquilco in the Valley of Mexico. It's worth pointing out that Quiquilco is also located in the old stomping grounds of the Teuchitlán culture that we mentioned earlier as a possible early influence in West Mexico. Interesting coincidence, I thought. On top of the pyramids would have been a small structure, perhaps a temple to a god or family founder. But other pyramids were topped with ceremonial poles, and you can see many examples of these in those little Ixtlan del Rio dioramas that we mentioned earlier. In this example here, we can see a sculpture of a circular precinct, and coming out of the top of the pyramid is a large pole. Although none of these poles have survived, archaeologists have found large post holes in many of these pyramids that confirm what these works are showing us. Now, you might be wondering what the heck that pole is for and why there's a guy planking on top. There's no way that that's comfortable. While a commonly shared belief in Mesoamerican cosmology is the idea of a world tree, or axis mundi, that connects the earthly realm with the divine. If you watched my video on the classic Maya, this should sound familiar. Trees were also associated with rulership in some areas of Mesoamerica, and thus these poles were powerful symbols of earthly rule and divine connection. A ruler or priest could thus ascend the pole to mediate between his people and the gods, ancestors, or other supernatural forces. There are actually several scenes of tree climbing in West Mexican art that may be showcasing such rituals. However, archaeologists have also pointed out that this scene and others like it are actually very similar to voladores in Mexico today. For those who have never heard of this, the Palo Volador is a Mesoamerican ritual still practiced today in Veracruz and other areas of Mexico, where several men scale a tall pole, tie themselves to it, and leap off, spinning around the pole. One person typically remains on top of the pole, usually dancing or playing an instrument. This tradition has very ancient roots, and some scholars believe that these West Mexican scenes are depicting an early form of the Palo Volador. Again, this is all speculation, but I do find it very interesting. The pyramid in the main precinct at the site has stairways that face the cardinal directions, as well as different platforms. This arrangement is believed to be part of a cosmogram that manifested the universal order. Across Mesoamerica, many cultures have created circular cosmograms with radiating circles that are often segmented into four parts. Modern Huichol people, who may be descended from these West Mexican cultures, divide the world into five sectors: the four cardinal directions and the axis mundi. This conception of the universe meshes really nicely with what we see at Teuchitlán sites. We should also note that these poles would have cast shadows that would have aligned with certain solar events. Christopher Whitmore has also pointed out that these poles could have marked solar zenith when their shadows would have been completely absent. For all those people like me who live north of the Tropic of Cancer, this is when the sun is directly above you and casts a shadow directly below you. For anything straight, the shadow completely disappears. I mean, check out this picture and tell me that that isn't the craziest thing you've seen. One other architectural feature that we see here are ball courts. These spaces were used to play the Mesoamerican ball game, and in West Mexico, there's a large amount of art that shows us scenes of ball games and ball players. These depictions of ball games also show crowds watching the games being played. Now, the exact details of the Mesoamerican ball game are not entirely understood. Later Spanish accounts detailed how the Nahua played the game in the former Aztec Empire. But it's believed by modern scholars that the ball game varied across time and space in Mesoamerica. Different areas likely had different rules, different methods of scoring, and different gear, even if they played on similarly designed courts. I mean, just think of how many games you can play with a ball on a football or soccer field. In West Mexican art, we can see depictions of ball players holding balls and wearing protective gear. These games were likely important community events and possible recreations of mythological games. All these pyramids, plazas, platforms, and courts provided ceremonial spaces that were as intricate as they were complex, and we actually see glimpses of this in Teuchitlan art. We've already seen examples of ceremonies involving poles or scaling trees, often interpreted as a way of communicating with the divine, but there are other ceremonies we can see as well. In this example, we see a ceremony set in one of the ceremonial precincts surrounded by four thatched buildings. In the center is a man, perhaps a ruler or a priest, holding a baton or a weapon, participating in some sort of ritual, perhaps an investiture ceremony. We also see more personalized representations of elite figures. There's some debate about whether these represent specific portraits of actual people or whether these are stylized representations. Regardless, we often see figures wearing elite clothing and jewelry with special accoutrements. In burial contexts, these are often interpreted as members of important lineages. We should briefly note that another aspect of ceremony we see in West Mexican art is shamanism. Many figures, especially these horned guys, have been identified as shamans engaging in ritual activity, although there are some scholars who dispute that. Regardless, such activities and ceremonies were probably important events that brought together communities and legitimized leadership. Another important ritual activity we see in this art is feasting. For ancient societies, feasting was very important for commemorating important rites of passage and life events, but they also would have been moments of lavish gift giving and would have helped seal political agreements and instill loyalty. There are many examples of individuals eating and drinking, as well as finely made ceremonial vessels and plates for such occasions. Ritual drinks likely included maize beer, pulque, and mezcal. We even see scenes of whole households feasting with parents, children, pets, and even the dead. These two-story dioramas often show figures in a niche below the house, and it's widely believed that these represent familial tombs, and such scenes incorporate deceased family members into the rituals. Remember from the tombs at Huitzilapa that food offerings were made to the dead, and although these could have been left to sustain them in the afterlife, it could also be interpreted as a part of a funerary feast. Now, the Teuchitlán culture was not some frat house where everybody partied all day long. West Mexico had a healthy martial tradition that we see commemorated in art. Sculptures of warriors are very common, and these are quite detailed, showing warriors with weapons and armor. This was likely an important aspect of elite power. Drawing from other better understood Mesoamerican traditions, rulers were often expected to act as war leaders. They often had to prove this by participating in ritualized warfare against neighboring enemies and capturing warriors on the battlefield. So it should be no surprise that we also have examples of bound captives in sculpture as well, especially from Colima. On a slightly more gruesome note, there's also some instances of trophy heads being displayed by warriors. People in West Mexico were no strangers to violence, and we can see that martial valor was being celebrated in these figurines. No cowards need apply here, gentlemen and ladies. Now, at this point, you may be wondering what life was like for people of the Teuchitlán culture. Archaeology shows that these people were living in farming villages, raising crops and harvesting local resources. We know from various sources that people here had a broad variety of foods available. The staple crop, as it was for most of Mesoamerica, was maize, though plenty of other crops were available. Sweet potatoes, avocados, chilies, beans, and squash were regularly consumed. In fact, a lot of these foods appear in the designs of ceramic pots. One plant in particular that was very important was the agave, or maguey, which could supply fiber for spinning, food, and sap for fermenting into various alcoholic drinks. For meat, besides the regular assortment of wild game like deer, rabbits, and the like, they also had a few domesticated options, like turkeys, the occasional Muscovy duck, and dogs. Yeah, remember those cute, chubby little dogs from earlier? Yeah, they were likely being fattened for food. Sorry to ruin them for you. Rivers and lakes provided sources of fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and waterfowl. People of the Teuchitlán culture also exploited other materials on a large scale. Salt from the nearby Lake Saula was being harvested in such large quantities that archaeologists believe that it was being shipped to the cities of the Teuchitlán core. Another important resource was obsidian. Being in a volcanic area, West Mexico is blessed with an abundance of obsidian, and it was the preferred tool material. Evidence of workshops for obsidian and shell have been recovered at Guachimontones, showing that these were being processed not just for local needs, but likely as trade goods. Speaking of trade and exchange, let's pull the camera back and look at West Mexico as part of Mesoamerica. What was their relationship to the wider region? As we mentioned earlier, there appears to have been no Olmec influence in West Mexico, but there's some evidence to suggest that West Mexico had contact with the wider Mesoamerican world. As we pointed out earlier, Teuchitlan architecture conforms very nicely to ancient Mesoamerican cosmology. If you're disposed to the voladores theory that we mentioned earlier, you could argue that the fact that this was practiced in other areas of Mexico at European contact must mean that West Mexico had contact with the rest of Mesoamerica. But did any later Mesoamerican influences come into West Mexico? During the Classic period, Teotihuacan had turned into a cultural juggernaut in central Mexico, but it doesn't appear to have reached the Teuchitlan area. Foreign items such as jade and shell do appear in small amounts. Remember that these were both found in Huitzilapa. However, it's very likely that West Mexico did have more exposure to their neighbors than meets the eye, because of trade routes that would have connected central Mesoamerica, the Pacific coast, and the American Southwest. These would have carried goods like turquoise, cacao, shells, and cotton textiles. Those who have watched our Chaco Canyon and Hohokam episodes should be familiar with these trade routes, and it's likely that the Teochitlan people acted as agents in this trade. After all, they likely spoke Uto-Aztecan languages like their brethren to the north and west. This would have wired them into wider trade networks. As I mentioned earlier, there's some speculation that obsidian may have been exported from West Mexico. It was in very high demand elsewhere and widely traded between different groups, and West Mexico had a lot of it. However, I was not able to find any chemical analyses that have actually sourced obsidian in Mesoamerica to West Mexico. Might be a cool topic for some hungry post-grad researchers to jump on. However, we are going to see an eerie connection with Mesoamerica in the decline of the Teuchitlan culture. Over time, the Teuchitlan culture spread its influence beyond its core region. We see similar architecture pop up outside of the core area, across Jalisco, into southern Nayarit, and even as far south as Colima and as far east as Guanajuato. It was becoming a force in West Mexico. However, by about 400 CE, it was starting to run out of steam. Population began to decline, and resources appeared to have been strained. Pollen analyses have suggested that there may have been massive deforestation around the core area. The political apparatus leading the Teuchitlan culture was breaking down and could not muster the resources to continue its monumental ambitions. By 500 CE, the population of Guachimontones had collapsed and very little construction was taking place. Around 700 CE, new arrivals from the Bajío region, referred to as the El Grillo culture, began to inhabit the site. Even after the population recovered and stabilized in the post-classic period centuries later, no new major construction would ever occur at the site. However, the decline of the Teuchitlán culture should not be seen as an isolated event, because it was part of a much larger phenomenon that followed across Mesoamerica. From the middle to the end of the classic period, several states began to collapse, starting with Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. Zapotec Monte Alban and lowland Maya city states eventually followed suit. From this, it would appear that whatever was wreaking havoc across Mesoamerica was not sparing West Mexico either. We aren't going to get into the theories behind the classic collapse. That's a topic for a future episode. The Teuchitlán culture represents a very unique blossoming of Mesoamerican culture in a somewhat remote section of the continent. Although it never assumed the power and grandeur of its eastern contemporaries, it left an artistic legacy that is just as impressive as the rest of Mesoamerica. In fact, West Mexican art enjoyed a bona fide renaissance in the 20th century. In the 1930s, Mexican artists, most notably Diego Rivera, Rufino Tamayo, and Frida Kahlo, sought out this art, assembled collections, arranged exhibits, and drew a lot of inspiration from it. It's easy to see why. This is a striking and vigorous art produced by master craftsmen, and it shows us a distant past in rich detail where people celebrated and honored their dead and loved their friends and families. It's a shame that West Mexico and the Teuchitlán tradition are so often forgotten in popular considerations of Mesoamerica, when it's every bit as compelling. The late Dr. David Grove summed this up really well in a beautiful metaphor.
My viewpoint about Mesoamerica during the pre-classic and classic as well is like a family which has 3 precocious daughters. One of them lives in the south and is a magnificent sculptor who makes beautiful stone objects. The second daughter lives in the highlands and becomes a magnificent architect. The third daughter lives in the west, but people have ignored her because she doesn't look like a member of the family. But how many of our sons are like each other or develop in the same way? Surely the third daughter has all the important features of the family and is important in her own right, because she used her creativity to produce fabulous ceramic pieces, and that is her distinctive mark. She was a magnificent potter who interacted with her 2 sisters, actively contributing to her family through time. Each daughter was different, but all 3 were an important part of the Mesoamerican family.
With that in mind, we should remember West Mexico for its wonderful art, its incredible architecture, and rich culture. If you ever find yourself in Guadalajara or Puerto Vallarta and decide to pay a visit to the little town of Tequila for some fine, authentic mezcal, pay a visit to Guachimontones. Think back on that artistic legacy as you walk through the ruins, and I'm sure the site will come alive again. And speaking of travel, it's time for that special announcement I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Earlier this year, I and several other channel followers made a trip to Peru and had an incredible time seeing Inca ruins and sites, getting our llama fix, and eating delicious Peruvian food. It was a wonderful trip, and it was awesome to travel with people from all over the world. So I'm very pleased to announce that we'll be doing another trip next January to Oaxaca, Mexico, where I and other viewers will visit the Zapotec sites of Mitla and Monte Alban, among others. Along the way, we'll learn about Zapotec textiles, have a traditional Zapotec lunch, and even take a cooking class. If you've wanted to travel to Oaxaca and get a glimpse at Zapotec culture, you can click the link below to review all the trip details and book your spot. Remember, space is limited, so please don't wait until the last minute. I'm really excited about this, and I hope that many of you are too. Let's go to Mexico. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description below. Also, special thanks to Anthony DeLuca for his invaluable assistance and feedback on this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. We'll see you in our next episode. Take care.